Hello and welcome to our webinar. My name is Luke Talbot, Director of Product Marketing here at Questback.
And hi everybody, my name is Nicola Matson, Director of Sales Enablement and Support, also at Questback.
Thanks. Okay, today we're going to talk about how to improve employee attraction, ramp up and retention. Basically why you need to take an integrated approach to your employee journey. We're going to be looking firstly at how organizations are faced with challenges around talent recruitment, productivity and retention. And finally, we're going to end up by showing some of the benefits of actually starting to listen to your employees across their whole journey with you. And I think as we start, it's almost impossible to talk about attraction, ramp up and retention to an organization without starting to think about this war for talent, which we've heard about for the last couple of decades now. People have been saying that there's a war for talent between organizations for the best people in the marketplace who need to work with your organization. And anyone who's been through any kind of hiring journey at the moment, from an organization's point of view, will certainly feel this. It definitely feels like it's you against your competition to make sure that people come along and join you and you can hire them as quickly as possible and get them productive and make sure they stay.
I absolutely agree with everything that you're saying, although I do think that only paints part of the picture. I think for too long now we've been very employer-centric and looked at as an organisation and how we go about that attraction and recruitment. And I think things are changing, and actually the balance of power is shifting a little bit. We're starting as employers to fish for talent in an ever-decreasing talent pool. We know that it's getting much easier for people to change jobs. Actually, they prefer to change jobs more frequently. So really start that power of control is now sitting more with the employee. And given that, I think we need to really start to gain some insights from those individuals about how they're thinking and feeling about us as an employer.
Interesting. So as we start talking about the balance of power shifting towards the employee, maybe turning into more of a buyer's market, I guess that leads us to this other concept where the war for talent is over. The talent won, right? And I think we've all been hearing this over the last few years, people talking about the talent winning, and that. So I guess let's move on to see a little bit about what that might look like from an employee's point of view. Well, starting out, I think that we see one of the things we see now is that experiences are starting to matter much more than just being tied down to one job or one company. And I think this idea of a job for life is certainly something that the past generations have certainly subscribed to, but now it's much more about why are you doing the job, why is it meaningful, and collecting maybe a portfolio of experiences across your career, and also not just necessarily connecting why you studied to what you then end up doing and moving every few years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you say, people are starting to build out a portfolio of experiences, and that may either be achieved by changing organisations or even just moving within an organisation. So, I spent 11 years with my last employer, but the reality was that I had 5 jobs whilst I was with that employer so that I could continue to grow out and build some breadth in terms of that skills and experience that I was gaining. Yeah,
and then that portfolio thinking, I guess, leads us to maybe slightly lower barriers to switching then. So if we've got more of a portfolio of skills and we're more used to moving, then that sort of momentum might start to continue.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so many changes that have happened, over the last 5-10 years have impacted the way that we go about finding jobs and moving into new positions. Simple things I think everybody's talked about exhaustively, but social media, access to jobs through social media, but also just the way we approach job hunting now has changed. Gone are the days, and I'm probably showing my age a little bit here, where you might have a newspaper and a highlighter pen and you're ringing the vacancies that you think are interesting to you. I had a chat with a friend at the weekend actually, and he was saying about how he had actually just approached an organisation that he'd seen was moving into the European market to see if they were looking for someone to help spearhead that business, and he's now in an interview cycle. There wasn't even a job posted for that particular role, so it's much easier to find new vacancies now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess as you start to see people moving more often, then you're going to start to get then more of the backfilling as well. So there's going to start to be a bit of a skills shortages as you need to hire more frequently.
Absolutely, and I think there's a couple of points to that. Yes, people are moving and we need to backfill and fill those positions. We're also starting to see entire job families disappear, with the advent of AI and bots, and it's starting with things like manufacturing and transport, but I think, in the longer term that's going to impact a lot of different jobs, but new jobs are coming to the market as well. So, I remember when people talking about a digital or social marketing manager was something quite new. I've spoken to companies now that have people whose job title is people analytics for HR, and those are new positions with new skills and requirements. So we're definitely seeing a skill shortage. I think sometimes people focus a little too much on the STEM jobs and talk about how we need more science and technology and engineering and maths jobs, but the reality is that we've got a skill shortage across the board for both soft skills and hard skills, and that's another reason why that balance of power is shifting, because me as an individual with a portfolio of skills and experiences, I'm now valuable to so many more organisations.
Yeah, and I think we're definitely starting to paint a picture, I guess, of employees being more in control, it being more of a buyer's market. And I guess that leads us to what that might look like from a company's point of view. Let's go back to this to the company's perspective a little bit. And if we take a helicopter view of the overall journey that employees go through with an organisation, this is a really, really high level view, obviously. But we'll start with recruitment and trying to get the top talent into the organisation and attract them through that recruitment process. And unfortunately, the reality is your good candidates will probably drop out or can drop out. Then for them, you then manage to hire people, they go through onboarding, but then you get this kind of almost very disappointing thing when new hires just aren't productive enough quickly enough, and that can be incredibly frustrating. And finally, the unfortunate exit where good people leave, and that can be totally soul destroying as part of that whole process. You put all this effort into getting people into the company and they just don't stay long enough. So let's have a look at what the actual impact might be to a company of these things. If we just take the recruitment at the moment and these good candidates dropping out, actually any candidate dropping out, if they've had a negative experience, what we know is that they're likely to start sharing that. This statistic up on the screen here is people who just stop or using or purchasing products after a negative candidate experience. What we also know is I think it's about 81% of people who have a negative experience are likely to share that, socialize it across their network. You think about new social platforms like Glassdoor and LinkedIn. It's incredibly easy for people to do that. They have a higher propensity to start doing it now because it's more common. If you look at actually people stop using or purchasing products after a negative experience, you might be thinking, well, it doesn't apply to me. I can see how that applies to a company that sells crisps or something like that. But I sell massive industrial generators worth $500,000, and it's unlikely if the people joining my company were about to buy one.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. I've had conversations with customers and colleagues on exactly that topic. I think the reality is we're so interconnected now that we really don't necessarily know the impact of any one interaction with any individual. And there's a great story about this, and I'd love to take the credit, but it was actually from a friend of mine. But they were telling me about a lady who had rang up an insurance company to get car insurance, and for whatever reason they decided she was too high risk. They weren't particularly pleasant in that experience with her and declined that insurance. She happened to be married to the CEO of a large multinational organisation who just happened to have their annual insurance through that insurance provider, and her husband called up and cancelled a contract that was worth over $2 million a year. So it's obviously an extreme example, but as I say, we really don't know the impacts and the ripples of those interactions with people because of that interconnectivity now.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's something that we shouldn't neglect to look at. And also, taking it a little bit back to the whole purpose and what the aim you have is to attract the right kind of talent to your organisation. So yeah, there are huge impacts on potentially your top line there and of what a negative experience might do. But what that will all build up as well is an image of a company that people don't want to join. Absolutely. So that will directly impact your attraction as these negative experiences start to filter through on social platforms.
Exactly, and that shrinking talent pool, you can't afford to alienate even one person. You need to have as wide a talent pool as possible to fill your skill shortages.
Exactly, but let's assume you did hire someone. So they start to go through onboarding, so we've got them in, and then you get this rather depressing statistic that actually, and this is based on a typical sort of white-collar work, they're only about 50% productive after 3 months, and might only go up to about 75% after, let's say, 6 months, or a little bit less, and then basically between 6, 9, 12 months, you're looking at about 100% productivity. They really aren't productive fast enough.
Yeah, and I laughed when we found this statistic because, as you well know, I think I'm 3.5 months into my employment with Questback, and my maths is poor, but I'm guessing that, I don't know, maybe puts me at around 55% productive. Feels like I'm a lot more, but maybe I'm not. But you know, I think the 50% don't get too thrown by that, because I'm sure there's people on the webinar today thinking that's not right for the job families I'm in charge of, for the industry or the vertical that we work within, because you know there will be differences for different types of roles. What's more important is to think about how we can impact that figure by a nominal amount, and what difference that makes to us as an organisation. So let's say you tell us that actually people are 100% productive after 3 months, but 50% after 6 weeks. If we could shave 2 days off that time for every person you bring into the business, so let's say you hire 500 people a year, they're 100% productive, you know, 2 or 3 days more quickly, that is tangible in terms of the cost savings to the organisation.
Yeah. Absolutely, and I think if we talk about having a great onboarding experience or recruitment experience, you can actually start to see how that might directly impact your productivity as well. If you have a poor recruitment experience and then you kind of, you know, when you arrive in the organisation that doesn't match up to what you were sold in the recruitment part, then you can see why somebody might not be willing to sort of give 100% immediately. They might not really understand where they fit.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I mean, my background is predominantly actually in recruitment and onboarding, and what I've seen in a lot of organisations is a huge amount of investment in the recruitment process, looking at attracting the right individuals and how we bring them into the organisation. And then there's a handover often to a different part of the business that are responsible for onboarding. And sometimes they fall off a bit of a cliff. So they have this, you know, really tight hand-holding experience through the recruitment process. They sign their contract. They've got a 1 to 3 months notice period. And suddenly I don't hear from that employer anymore, and my engagement levels drop, and I actually come into the business feeling quite negative about a company that I was so excited about joining at the point that I accepted that offer.
Yeah, indeed. And unfortunately, that leads us directly to the next statistic, which is, you know, your good people leave. You know, what we know is that 1 in 4, about 25% of your new hires leave within a year, which can be, I mean, talking about soul destroying. You spend all that effort getting people, attracting them, onboarding them. They're not even fully productive probably, and then yet they're already leaving. And there's another statistic that we were looking at, which is 1 in 5 new hires are actually regretted by the business. You know, they were bad decisions. And I would love to see a Venn diagram actually that shows the 1 in 5 people who were a bad decision versus the 1 in 4 people who leave within a year. And I'm willing to put some money on the fact that they don't perfectly intersect, because actually the people who are more likely to leave voluntarily within a year, going back to your mobility of your workforce and the skills and the buyer's market we were talking about earlier, these are the people who actually have those opportunities out there. So actually, you're probably not going to be left with the top talent that you recruited in the first place.
Completely agree.
Yeah. And when we look at the cost to replace an employee equivalent to a year's salary, well, the impact there on your bottom line is pretty huge. Okay, well, this paints a particularly depressing picture of, of how things are going wrong or could be going wrong. So let's have a quick look at what we can start doing to resolve this. And what we actually see is organizations starting to focus on employee journeys to get ahead, rather than just focusing on specific touch points, such as, people joining the organization or people leaving the organization. And we'll see why over the next few slides. But it's worth saying actually that organizations do face some challenges in delivering this full end-to-end experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. One is, if you think about that full end-to-end candidate through to employee, potentially through to an alumni journey, there are often different people and different parts of the business that are responsible for those individual processes. So it's often quite siloed, even if people are getting insight and feedback at those different touch points. And also, particularly for the large enterprise organisations, up until quite recently, often had a best-of-breed approach with their technology providers as well. So they might have one recruitment system, a second onboarding technology, a third HRMS system. So that creates a technology barrier as well in terms of capturing insight right the way through that full journey.
Mm. And I think when we have then more than one person responsible for the overall experience, it starts to get a bit disjointed. What we then also know is that perceptions decisions are made up over multiple rather than single touch points. You've got, even though it's turned into a buyer's market, and yes, your employees are a little bit more in control than they used to be, you're still paying them a salary at the end of the month. They still have to pay their mortgage, and so it's unlikely that one negative experience at work is going to completely make them flip and change. That might be an extreme example. But what you tend to find is that small things, maybe something during the recruitment journey made them think, something, maybe have some doubts, maybe during onboarding we dropped the ball a bit, they dropped off the cliff, as you were saying, Nicola. And then finally, once they get into the normal running in the organisation, they feel like they don't fit anymore, and that's just enough to make them start looking elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting, interesting point. If you go back to that different people being responsible for different parts of the processes, there may be people on the webinar today that are thinking, I'm responsible for onboarding, and I get feedback at the end of onboarding, and I know whether or not I'm running a good process. But what you don't have visibility of, if you're siloed and focusing just at that one particular point in the journey, is are there any other experiences or interactions that are happening with that employee before they join the onboarding program that are impacting your scores and your feedback? Because as you said, Luke, maybe somebody had a particularly bad experience in recruitment, and that was compounded upon by something that happened in onboarding that led to a much lower score than you would expect if they had only had that onboarding experience.
Yeah, and that quite neatly takes us actually to where a lot of this journey-based thinking comes from, and we've got a lot of experience now from customer experience measuring and measuring customer journeys, and this is a statistics from McKinsey, where they've shown that actually measuring across whole and journeys is 30% more strongly correlated to business outcomes than just measuring specific touch points. And I think quite instinctively, that's probably true. If somebody calls up the contact center and says, that they want to leave the cable provider and they're very angry or something, then actually measuring just that one interaction and that one touch point and how we did there is a very poor indicator of why people are leaving us as a provider. What you need to look at is their entire customer journey. And then that leads us to this this ultimate thing here, which is you actually need to start treating your employees a little bit more like consumers.
Yeah, and I think this is quite an emotive topic, or at least in my experience based on the conversations that I've had to date about this. There are some inherent challenges around transposing wholesale the way that we look at and measure consumer experiences and the way that we look at employees, because of course there are differences. And even though we see this balance shifting slightly, I still as an employee have a reliance on my employer to, as you say, pay salaries and pay my mortgage. But the reality is the parallels and similarities in terms of those journeys and those interactions are much more significant than the differences. So there's still a lot to learn from the consumer world that we can bring into the workforce.
Yeah, excellent. So let's take a look at what that might actually look like. So what's it look like when we do start looking at the entire employee journey? Well, let's zero in a little bit on one of the ones we've mentioned a few times, is recruitment and entry. So getting candidates into the organisation, turning them into employees. What we can already see is that while this is just one small journey, it's actually already looking like it has quite a lot of different touch points along it.
Yeah, and actually the reality is this is a particularly simple recruitment process.
Yeah.
I wish I could have put my processes that I mapped many years ago into one slide. The reality is there are more touch points than we're representing here, and different touch points, and even the nature of that relationship is changing. Yeah. There's video interviewing, there's psychometric testing, there's assessment centres. So this is an indicative high level, but you're absolutely right, there are more interactions than we show here.
Exactly. So just looking at it like this, I guess it wouldn't be advisable to actually try to get feedback at every point here. I think it would be a little bit insane to start asking for feedback at every stage in that candidate journey. In fact, I think what you might end up doing is turning a lot of candidates off with just the intensity of your company. So what you actually need to do is again take another step back and have a look at the journey from a slightly higher level.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's interesting though, we're talking about survey fatigue and a concern that we're trying to capture too much feedback during that particular part of the journey. But I was reading a study only last week actually from TMP that said only 11% of organisations capture any feedback throughout this recruitment process. So I think there's a huge improvement that we as employers can make around this recruitment and entry experience.
Exactly, and the point there is, I guess, you've got to start capturing feedback all along it, but not to just have that knee-jerk overreaction, which is we need feedback, fantastic, yes. Let's get it everywhere.
Yeah,
so when we start looking at what that best practice might look like, well, let's focus on that critical phase, which is this first year. And when we look at that first year, you do start to see there are some standout touch points across that journey that you do need to start measuring across. Now, obviously, if you've been here 5 years or been in the company 5 years, there's a bigger gap between your onboarding and your exit, and there are probably steps in there like promotion, etc. But just focusing on that first year where we're trying to reduce the 25% who decide to leave, these are the touch points that you look at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you're right. As you say, there are definitely other things that happen throughout my lifetime as an employee with an employer that we could look to measure and get insight on. But if you want the biggest bang for your buck, for want of a better expression, I think these are the key points, as you say, in that first year and exit, where we can really start to gain some insight.
Yeah, and the focus here is measuring consistently across that, having something consistent and meaningful that you can actually measure across all of these touch points that makes them relatable one to the other. And that gets us away immediately from this siloed approach where actually, most companies I think I've interacted with would always measure exit surveys, but they tend to focus maybe on some of the more process-specific questions, like why are you leaving, etc. And none of that is directly relatable to what you might ask somebody at interview stage.
I completely agree, and I know actually you're going to cover in a second, that process questions still have their place. Absolutely, we need to get feedback from our candidates and our employees to make sure that the way that we interact with them is as optimized as possible. But as you say, what we really want to look to do, if we're going to get real value from the insight that we can gain from candidates and employees, is to make sure that we're measuring something consistently across the full journey or life cycle that allows us to predict specific outcomes that are important to us as an organisation. And that means, that consistency means that we can trend not only over time in terms of an organisation, and are we seeing improvements based on maybe interventions that we've put in place, but also at the individual journey level, so that we can see how specific individual interventions impacted how that person's feeling about us as an employer.
Exactly. But clearly we're not going to forget the process-specific questions. You do still need these, and you need these so that you can implement very specific targeted organizational improvements. What is it that went wrong at that touch point? What is it that made me feel differently about the organization or something like that? After onboarding, for instance, to make something that's absolutely actionable. The worst thing about doing feedback and not acting, there's nothing worse than collecting feedback and not acting on it, so you need to get something actionable out of it. Finally, I guess one of the most important aspects here is to make sure that everything is process-based. This actually has to be embedded into your business processes. If it isn't embedded into your business processes, then you can't trigger these interactions automatically. And that is vital, so that you can get this constant trickle of information from the organization and get a sense for exactly what's going on. So you need to avoid situations where people have to manually trigger these. Okay, so that takes us on to the FIT model.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about this, because I think this is quite important. So we just talked then about the importance of having a consistent set of questions that we're asking candidates and employees to answer that allow us to predict outcomes that are important to us as a business. And you can see some outcomes on the slide there. I'm sure everybody on the webinar would absolutely love to reduce turnover, increase job satisfaction, job performance. It's kind of the nirvana. In terms of how we've looked at this, if you think back, and I'll cover recruitment because that's more my area of expertise, but if you look at the way that we've gone about attracting and recruiting over the years, academic research has very much moulded the approaches that we take. So we use occupational psychologists to do things like psychometric testing. You might speak with employment branding experts around how to look at what good looks like within your organisation and make sure that you reflect that in an accurate way on your website. And that's absolutely what we've looked towards when we started to look at how can we measure things that will impact whether somebody will stay with us, to perform well and recommend us. And what we found is a huge raft of academic research around fit theory. And put simply, all fit theory means is if a person perceives that they fit well with the organisation that they work for and the people that they work with in that organisation, you will see all of the benefits that are on the slide there. So good fit basically leads to good work, putting it simply. So how do we measure that fit? It's not as simple as one question. There are different dimensions that we measure, and actually we can go more granular within those particular dimensions, but the key ones I'll show you in a second. There is no real hierarchy here. We've just represented this as a battery getting nice and filled up and energized, because that's what we want from our employees. And actually, the obvious one is to look at whether or not I feel I fit with an organisation. We know that that predicts whether or not somebody is likely to stay with the organisation or leave the organisation. But we also want to know how they feel they fit with the role that they're actually being employed to do, and very critically also the people that they work with, so their supervisor and their team. So by asking just 4 simple questions around the perceived fit across these dimensions, we can start to predict some of the outcomes that you can see there on the slide.
Yeah, and I think quite instinctively, I mean, certainly from my experience, I think fit to organisation, it just feels a little bit more important. Bearing in mind what we said about employees now starting to look for experiences rather than jobs for life. So, you know, is what I'm doing meaningful? Is it progressing? Do I believe in where the company's going? So, actually, a fit to an organisation is quite important. You know, are they socially responsible, environmentally responsible, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was quite interesting for me reading some of the research. This was new to me. And actually, as I said, the research shows that the perceived fit to organisation can predict whether or not someone is likely to stay or leave. We shouldn't underestimate the importance of the other three dimensions, though. If you think about fit to role, if I might love my employer, really be aligned to the vision and mission, but I'm just in the wrong job, I'm not likely to be fully productive and successful in that role, which will eventually have an impact on how engaged I am within that role in the organisation. So all of these are very important. They predict different business outcomes that we can see on the slide, and that's why we ask all 4 questions.
Exactly. So the great thing is seeing a fit to the organisation, but a declining fit to the role might actually mean that you need to move up or around in the organisation, which is another good thing to keep on top of. Okay, so everything we've talked about towards the beginning, so it painted quite a depressing picture of how this might look. But hopefully, by doing things right, you can start to actually get some of the positive benefits and actually lessen the impact of this. So actually getting a positive impact would be great. So if we started to follow some of these early warnings and trends, we would allow the organisation to do some interventions to actually turn things around. And indicators of poor candidate experience. What we know is that, you know, from the previous, at the beginning of the presentation, we showed that, you know, a poor candidate experience, 81% of people are going to start sharing that, a significant proportion are going to stop buying your products. If you turn that around, then actually 50% of your candidates will start telling their network about a positive experience. And again, that all helps to attract more talent in the future to the organisation, but also sets people off really on the right foot as they join and they start going onto the next stage. And the next one, it indicates a low productivity. So if productivity is low if people have a poor experience in the recruitment journey, and then they move into the onboarding journey, then actually they're not going to be as productive. But if they had a positive experience, then they're going to give about 15% more discretionary effort.
Yeah, and I love this term, discretionary effort. I've talked about this a lot with organisations when we look at their onboarding programme. And people often think of this in terms of the discretionary effort that people will give an employer once they're actually employed by that employer, which is absolutely critical. But, you know, there's another thing to look at here, which is what happens to that person at the point that they accept an offer and up until the point that they join on day one. You know, there are very simple measures that we can put in place to make sure that we remain in contact with that individual, but also they want to learn about your organisation. They want to be successful. They want to know who their teammates will be. They want to know where they sit within the company, who the SMEs are that they should be speaking to. So we can start to drip feed the content and information during that onboarding process that is ultimately going to shorten that time to productivity, whilst also keeping them more engaged and connected with you as an employer.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, right at the very beginning, we talked about dropping off a cliff after recruitment, and there are 2 different ways that you can actually intervene to turn these things around from negative experiences to positive. Yeah, you could do an individual intervention, which is, you know, maybe during the candidate experience, you've got one person who's maybe giving you some negative feedback or is having a poor experience. You could just pick up the phone and talk to that person. It's a good example of a positive, react fast, turn it around, turn a negative into a positive. But actually, what about the organizational interventions? Maybe we find that, you know, people who are going through the recruitment journey are being sold this picture of an amazing organization with a great vision and, you know, no challenges at all. And then when they join, they land and they get their feet on the ground and they're running around during onboarding, and they find that actually, you know, there's a lot of stuff that's going on that doesn't quite match up with the picture they were sold. And I can completely see how somebody joining that kind of environment might not be quite as willing to give as much discretionary effort. They might think, hang on, I was slightly missold this. It's kind of like the employee equivalent of thinking you're buying broadband and then ending up with a terrible supplier who doesn't give you connection. Okay, and I guess finally that leads us to the next point, so indicators of risk of churn. So if you can turn around all of that, if you can give a great candidate experience, give a great onboarding experience, then what we know is that people who've gone through that are 38% more likely to have a higher intent to stay in the organisation, which is really great because that just helps us to reduce that, you know, 1 in 4 people just wanting to just move on. they're in their minds thinking, I've made a poor decision. We often think about this from the company's point of view. 1 in 5 hires is a mistake, but how many employees are wandering around after 3 months thinking, hang on a sec, was this a mistake? Okay, right, so I guess we've had a great look into why we need to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess maybe a quick recap, but I think we've talked about that impact of a poor candidate experience and the impact that can have in terms of our availability or access to other talent, but also a very tangible impact on our bottom line. We've talked about that time to productivity, and is there a way that we can reduce that? Not only saving cost to the business, but people feel happier in their role if they are enabled and know how to do that role and be successful in it. And then I think you very clearly articulated the last one, but if we've spent a huge amount of time and money invested into bringing a great person into the business, the last thing that we want is them to leave before they've even really started to add any value. Exactly.
And so we've had a good look at why, and we've also had a pretty good look at the sorts of things you would need to know in order to fix it, so the what as well.
Yeah, so I feel like you're now going to say to me, but how do we do this, Nicola?
It's almost as if we've practiced this.
It is.
Okay, well let's take a quick look at actually what we're going to do and how we can fix this. So I'm going to we're going to do a quick demonstration now of what Questback would do to help you address these challenges. I'm just going to make you the presenter.
Thank you. So just while Luke passes over control to me. So as Luke said, we're just going to do a very quick sort of 5-10 minute high-level overview of a solution that we recently launched called Employee Touchpoint. And this is something that we've designed to help businesses tackle some of those challenges that we've covered off during the discussion in the last 30 minutes. So we're actually looking at the landing page here, and just what I want to call out, when we looked at that overall end-to-end journey, we talked about what are the major touch points where we can really glean some deep insight that can help us see those business outcomes that we talked about. And we had 7 areas that we looked at. Interview, so when somebody's gone through that face-to-face interview with you as an employer, if they voluntarily drop out of the recruitment process, this is a gold mine of information about what is it about your organisation, maybe about your managers, your interviewers, that has meant that that person actually doesn't feel that they want to work for you. We look also at entry and onboarding. I think we've talked about that a lot already. And as Luke said, there's again very valuable insight to be gained when we go through somebody resigning and leaving the organisation. So typically these surveys would be sent automatically through to your candidates or employees. I'm actually just launching mine manually from the dashboard here, but they would receive an email invite. They're all mobile responsive, so very quick and easy to complete on a phone, so low barrier to completion. And we've got a number of different questions. I'm not going to go through the full survey today, but nice little slider scales. Very quickly I can say, how well do I feel that I fit with those 4 dimensions that we talked about earlier, the supervisor, organisation, team and role. And we have other questions built in around engagement, around net promoter score. So will this individual promote your organisation to friends or family? And also those specific process-based questions that also add some really valuable insight around, is there something that you could do to change that process to enhance that experience for the individual? But what we'll do is we'll look at it now from a manager's perspective. So we've talked about getting feedback from people at those touch points, but what do we actually do with that feedback? What does it tell us that allows us to realise where we might need to take interventions to see those great business benefits that we talked about? Well, let's go and look at a manager's view, and just quickly to explain what we're seeing on the screen here. So across the top, we have those 7 touch points that we saw on the dashboard in terms of the surveys. And if we hover over, it's actually just articulating this from the perspective of the employee or the candidate. So for example, if I'm looking at an entry process, I would assume that that candidate receives an offer. Maybe they compare it with some counter offers. They might go through some negotiation if they're not happy with the terms and conditions. They might have some pre-employment work, so background checks, bank details so I can get paid by my new employer. And then typically there'll be that first week where we start to look at some basic provisioning and setup. So what this shows us is the experiences of that individual for that touch point that we are asking to get feedback from them on through the surveys. Then we have some of the different questions. Obviously we only saw 4 when I showed you the survey there. As I mentioned, there are others. And we see the scores across those different touch points. At this particular point, I'm looking at it as an aggregated view for all of my employees. But I'm going to take just a very simple example. So Rachel is a new employee and I'm her manager. She's been with the organisation for 6 months. She's just finished her onboarding. I'm about to have a one-to-one with her, and I'm just a bit curious to see what sort of feedback has she given through the surveys that we've asked her to complete. As with most things in nature, red is bad. It's a warning. It's telling me that I've got something that I might need to be a little bit concerned about. So if I actually track this, what it's showing me is that in terms of how she felt she fit with the role within the organisation, it was sort of average during interview, but this is to be expected. I'm still learning a bit more about the role. But at the point that she came into the business, it's as high as we can hope for. And again, we'd expect this. If I've decided to accept this job with this company, we would hope that I do feel that I've got a good fit to the role. But what I start to see is this starts to drop fairly significantly within that first 6 months of employment. Now, at this point, I could already have a conversation with Rachel and maybe try to see from her perspective why she feels that she isn't actually a perfect fit with the role. But we can actually start to get a bit more granular insights. So I'm going to come over to my more detailed view. And as part of our survey, we actually offer a few questions around orientation, specifically sort of looking around that sort of onboarding approach.
And just while you're going into that, let's go a little bit about, we mentioned earlier about individual versus organisational interventions. And at this point, we're very much playing the role of Rachel and Rachel's manager or future manager, or in this case, sorry, manager, actually going in and looking at something that actually probably needs a bit of an individual intervention first. Maybe just a quick call to Rachel to get a bit more information. It could be as simple as a one-to-one that's coming up this week. And rather than the big organisational thing, which I think we'll come on to in a moment.
Absolutely. So let's take a look at that orientation set of questions. So we actually have 4 questions specifically around orientation, but I'm going to look at the aggregated view first. So what we can see on the right-hand side here is Rachel's aggregated scores across those 4 questions at the different touch points that we've already invited her to provide feedback. And what I can see is it doesn't really change dramatically. It peaked a little bit upon entry, probably to be expected, and then it's dropped a little bit during the onboarding process, but nothing too dramatic. So let's start to drill into specific questions. So acceptance is all around social acceptance. So how well does Rachel feel that her colleagues and her leaders are welcoming her into the organisation? Well, her scores here are fantastic. We can see at the point that she comes in, it's about a 4. Once she starts her onboarding, she's really feeling extremely accepted and welcomed within the organisation. In the interest of time, I'm just going to quickly go to her self-efficacy. What this question is really looking at is whether or not Rachel feels she has the right tools and information and resources to be successful in her job. And this is very worrying to me because I can see that when she came in, she did feel that would be the case. But actually by the end of her onboarding, bearing in mind that through onboarding, this is when we're meant to be giving her the tools, information and resources she needs to be successful in the role, it's dropped right down to a 2. Now this is something, again, I can tackle as a manager because I can speak to her and try and understand where she feels the gaps are. I can look at what was covered during that onboarding program to make sure that it was applicable for the role that I've employed her for.
Yeah, we can try to turn it around for that one individual. So that's kind of react fast, let's fix it quick and turn a negative into a positive. But actually, let's imagine that we've seen this, and that afternoon we happen to bump into the HRD, or maybe we just give them a call. Maybe we feel actually this is, is this a widespread thing? Do more people see this? I can see this from my team. I can see how that affects them. But we're a large multinational company. What about the rest of them?
Well, let's take a look then. So as you can see, I've also got a director view here. I've just got access to both views for my login, and this might be applicable because we might have people that are at an executive or director level within the company, but obviously they might have their own team members as well. So I might need to do both an individual and an organisational view. So here I'm looking at my entire downline or downstream within the organisation, again rolled up into an aggregated view. And you can see that the dashboard looks very similar to the one we saw earlier in terms of tracking that journey, those touch points throughout that year 1 experience for the employees with the organisation.
Absolutely, and as we start to look at this, not only can you see those trends organisationally and start to see if this is something that impacts the whole organisation, which we're going to see now, but also along the right-hand side you can see that this is where we focus a lot less on Rachel's own individual experience and more on the organisational experience. And is this something that's more widespread? We can start to filter by other demographics. So is this unique to France? Is Germany affected as well? How about the actual seniority of the career level? Or actually, one of the more emerging things is this something to do with gender? So can actually we see a gender gap emerging in the organisation? People feel differently based on different experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually what we can see if we go back to that perceived fit to role, and I should point out that as an HRD, I've got a few areas that I might need to look into, because actually I've got a fair amount of red showing up in here, but let's stick with the storyline of this, you know, this drop in self-efficacy, and that's related to how well someone feels they fit with the role. So we can see much what we saw for Rachel, you know, increases upon entry. It's sort of okay at the beginning of onboarding. By the end of onboarding, it started to drop, and at the point that people leave, they again are feeling that they don't have the right tools and resources. So let's quickly go over to the more detailed view and just go directly to that self-efficacy question. And I can see that over time, for the organisation as a whole, this is actually trending down. So I might want to actually take a wider organisational level intervention. So I have the ability to come into this huddle up area, both as a manager, as an executive or director, and create activities. So I have very kindly tasked Luke with looking at this particular issue. You know, and this is a relatively simple one, because we just need to look at mapping out those job families, looking at the processes, the tools, the information that those individuals need, and making sure that the curriculum for onboarding actually covers those. I also have the ability to ideate and collaborate with other managers or directors within the organisation. So maybe other people have done things that have worked particularly well, both at the individual and organisational level. So let's learn collectively from that experience and those successes.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where we can start to ideate around that and turn this into more of a learning for the whole organisation, right? So again, all feeding back into attraction, onboarding, and not just fixing it once, but fixing it for good. So that overall, as an organisation, we're bringing feedback to give us the power to really transform and move forward.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much, Nicola. I think we're coming close to time now. So what we're going to do is very quickly come back and have a look at if we've got any questions. Okay, so yeah, we do have a few questions coming in. The first question I have here is, really like what you've just shown. We have our own models and some existing questions, particularly around exit. Could we do something similar to what I've seen here, but with our own questions?
Great question. So employee touchpoint is a highly configurable solution. So the simple answer is yes. So for example, if you maybe have your own engagement model and your own engagement questions, you might want to swap those out and replace ours. All I would say is there has been, as we said earlier, a huge amount of research that has gone into the fit model and the questions that we use to evaluate that perceived fit. And we know that this fit will predict things like job satisfaction, performance, willingness to recommend, etc. So whilst absolutely you can swap in and out questions, we would recommend that that set of core questions is consistently measured across the full life cycle.
Excellent.
Okay, let's give you one, Luke. Okay, I'm going to pick this one because this has actually been some discussion internally as well. So question here says, you talk about asking someone during the interview process how they're feeling about the company and their manager. Do you really think that they would answer those questions honestly? Surely it's in their interest to say it's all great so they get the job.
Yeah, and I think we're all aware of human nature, right? So I think we can imagine if you're trying to get a job, and then you might just say that. But I think this goes all the way back to the very beginning when we spoke about the changing nature of how work is perceived for employees or future employees. And attitudes to work and organizations are definitely changing. So I think a level of trust and transparency is now almost expected. Mm-hmm. And it is to do with finding the right fit between you and the organization that you work for, rather than finding somewhere I just need a job and I need to get that. And that's obviously going to be the case sometimes. But it's also, I think, that trust and transparency is eventually going to lead to a much higher degree of openness between employees and their organizations. And we are seeing that now. We're seeing people moving to more frequent, certainly more open methods of communication, and that is translating into what they do personally, so how they share on social media like Glassdoor, etc., and LinkedIn. But it's also obviously in people's best interest, to be honest. The company is reaching out and asking, and I think people are now very used to just giving quite frank feedback.
Yeah, and exactly, and we've talked about the fact that it is becoming more of a buyer's market. There are opportunities out there for me. So do I really want to, say, yes, I think I'm a great fit for an organisation and for a role that I don't feel that I am a good fit for, because likely is that I'm going to come into that organisation and be unhappy and unsatisfied.
Pretty much only myself to blame when I don't like it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, right, so I think we've got time for just one more question, so we're going to take this one. Yeah, this is awesome.
Thank
you. Yeah, brilliant.
you.
Okay, we're going to end the question there. No, so this is awesome, and I would love to hear, love to have this kind of insight from our employees, but not really sure how this fits in with all our other systems. We're in the process of deploying SAP Employee Central globally, so would we build this in Employee Central?
So great question. You know, an Employee Central is absolutely great at what it does. It offers some deep core HR functionality and covers lots of other processes like performance management, learning management, and so on. I'm not sure why I'm telling you this because you probably know already if you're in the processes of deploying it. But I think the point is that these HR management systems and suite solutions are not set up or designed to capture insight in the way that we just saw. So you would need to spend a pretty significant amount of time and money if you want to build that out into Employee Touchpoint with comparable dashboards and so on. So actually what our customers are tending to do is simply put Employee Touchpoint alongside their core HMS. It's very simple. We just take a daily feed of data, then we handle all of the automation rules, the data collection, the dashboards that you just saw. And the good news is that we can get that up and running in as little as 4 weeks to start to see some results.
Absolutely. Okay, fantastic. Well, I think that's all we've got time for today, unfortunately. So that just leaves us to say thank you very much for attending. Thank you for watching the webinar and also for the great questions that we had in participation. If your question didn't get asked during the webinar, then we will try and get back to you individually as well so that you have a good answer. And just remains for me to say goodbye and thank you very much.
Yeah, goodbye and thank you.